She was just getting off her night shift, exhausted, alone, and hungry. He was a forgotten veteran. His dog, a retired K9, called useless by two cruel men. But what happened next outside that diner would leave over 500 soldiers in silent tears, and the entire hospital standing still. If you believe in quiet miracles, if you believe that God still works through the hands of strangers and the loyalty of animals, this story will move your soul. Comment amen if you believe loyalty is sacred. May God bless all who protect, who love, and who choose to stay. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that restore your faith in humanity. The wind that swept through Boulder, Colorado that night carried the quiet bite of impending snow, the kind that whispered down from the Rockies and settled like a secret over the streets. Rachel Carter, 29 years old and in the final year of her residency at Boulder Valley Medical Center, stepped out of the hospital's side entrance and exhaled into the cold, watching her breath vanish like steam. She stood 5'8", slender but strong in a way that spoke more of endurance than muscle, shoulders squared from years of pushing stretchers, lifting spirits, and bracing against loss. Her dark brown hair was tied in a loose knot, frayed strands curling around a face that bore the fatigue of a 16-hour shift. Beneath her long winter coat, her scrubs clung to her like the ghost of the trauma room. Blood she hadn't realized stained her pocket, the smell of antiseptic still lodged in her memory. Rachel's face was pale from exhaustion, but her amber-flecked eyes stayed sharp, trained from years of watching for subtle signs, a dropping pulse, a missed breath, or in life outside the ER, a moment that meant more than it seemed. She wasn't always this vigilant. There had been a time, before Captain Joel Carter, her father, had gone to Iraq and returned only as a name etched into bronze on a military cemetery wall, when Rachel had believed in things like safety and weekends. His death hadn't made her bitter, but it had left her with a quiet intolerance for cruelty and a strange tenderness for those who walked the world carrying invisible burdens. Tonight, with her hospital badge still clipped to her coat, she walked toward Maggie's Diner, a place with cracked neon and good coffee, a 5-minute walk from the hospital and 2 blocks past the bus depot where shift workers lingered. The bell above the door jingled as she pushed it open, and warmth enveloped her like a soft quilt. Inside, the scent of grilled cheese and burnt filter coffee clung to every surface. She shrugged off her coat and slid into a booth near the frosted window, stretching her sore legs and closing her eyes for just a breath. A waitress with a name tag that read Tina offered a tired smile. "Long night?" she asked. Rachel nodded. "Just coffee and a sandwich, please. Something warm." Tina nodded and shuffled away. That's when she saw them. At the far end of the counter, seated in stoic stillness, was an elderly man in a worn army green jacket. Frank Dawson, though Rachel didn't know his name yet, looked to be in his late 70s, with a square jaw dusted with white stubble and eyes that had the weathered, far-off sheen of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. His posture was still straight, the kind that betrayed decades of military service, even if the rest of the body had softened with time. His coat bore an old 101st Airborne patch barely visible beneath the fabric wear, and beside his stool, lying curled yet alert, was a German shepherd whose fur had begun to gray around the muzzle, but whose eyes flicked constantly, scanning the room with silent discipline. The dog wore a faded tactical vest with the word, "Retired K9 Do Not Pet," stitched along the side. Rachel couldn't stop looking. The man's hand occasionally dropped to the dog's head, fingers curling gently in the thick fur between its ears. The dog, Axel, did not flinch, did not relax. He was still working in his mind, even in retirement. Something about the scene hit Rachel hard. Maybe it was Axel's stillness, maybe the man's tired hands, or maybe it was just the way the world around them seemed to avoid their presence, like grief had made them invisible. Her coffee arrived, and she wrapped both hands around the mug like it might keep her tethered to the moment. Frank hadn't ordered anything more than a black coffee, and Rachel noticed he hadn't touched it in a while. He just sat there, staring forward, lost in a place beyond the steam of the room. There was something familiar in that, too, The way her father used to go quiet after the war when the fireworks of July 4th turned the backyard into a memory minefield. Rachel's sandwich arrived, and she took a small bite, glancing once more at the man and his dog. Tina returned to refill Frank's coffee, gently brushing a crumb from the counter near his elbow, and for the first time, he looked up. Their eyes met briefly. He gave a short nod to the waitress, then turned back to Axel. A part of Rachel wanted to walk over, to say something. But what? Thank you for your service? It felt cheap. She hated platitudes. Instead, she let the silence fill the space, honored it. The quiet wasn't awkward, it was sacred. It was the space soldiers and medics both understood. The space between trauma and healing. The dog shifted slightly, his ears twitching, and Rachel could tell. Axel had sensed her attention. Just then, the bell above the door jingled again. Two men entered, young, loud, their jeans sagging and voices grating. They laughed too loud at something vulgar and made their way toward the counter. Rachel sipped her coffee and tried not to react. One of the men, tall with a red beanie and a twitch in his left eye, noticed Frank and leaned toward his friend. "Check out the antique and his mutt," he snorted. The other one chuckled, voice sharp. "Bet the dog's got more medals than he does working limbs." Rachel's stomach tightened. Frank didn't react, didn't move. Axel, however, did. The dog shifted, posture straightening, a low rumble barely audible from across the room. Rachel's grip on her cup tightened. She watched as the men continued. "You bring that old beast out so you don't fall over?" No one else in the diner said a word. Not Tina, not the cook behind the metal window, no one. Rachel stood. Slowly. Controlled. She wasn't angry. She was done. Done with watching men like her father get mocked. Done with watching those who served be forgotten until Veterans Day made them fashionable again. She crossed the diner quietly and stood behind Frank's stool. Her voice was clear, calm, but firm. "Leave him alone." The men turned. Red Beanie's lip curled. "What's it to you?" Rachel didn't flinch. "He hasn't said a word to you. Neither has his dog. So sit down. Or leave." There was a pause. Then a small scraping sound as Red Beanie pushed his stool back. "We were just joking." "You're not funny," Rachel replied. The taller one snorted, but didn't argue. They turned and walked out, muttering, the bell above the door clattering again behind them. Rachel exhaled and turned to Frank. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured. "Yes, I did," she said, before returning to her seat. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the diner windows with soft warning. Inside, Axel finally lay down, resting his chin on his paws, eyes half-lidded but still alert. Rachel stirred her coffee with tired fingers and realized, despite the ache in her body, this was the first time all day she had felt awake. The wind outside Maggie's diner howled louder now, whipping against the glass panes like a restless memory. Inside, the heat from the old radiator hummed faintly, but the room had fallen into that strange hush that follows confrontation. Rachel Carter sat back down at her booth, her sandwich forgotten, coffee lukewarm. Her heart still thudded, not out of fear but from the friction of stepping into a moment when no one else would. The tension had begun to dissolve, like steam curling up from a forgotten mug, but the residue still clung to the air. Frank Dawson remained where he was at the counter, Axel now resting more comfortably beside his boots. The dog's ears flicked only slightly with every sharp sound outside, but his body had returned to a still readiness, like a soldier sleeping with one eye open. Rachel glanced back at him, and then to Frank, who hadn't turned again. There was something in the way his shoulders dipped that made her wonder if her interference had done more harm than good. Tina, the waitress in her 50s with graying curls tied into a bun and a permanent tilt of sympathy behind her eyes, returned with a refill for Rachel's coffee. "You okay, hon?" she asked gently, her voice low, like she didn't want to stir whatever remained of the storm. "I'm fine," Rachel said, forcing a small smile. "Thanks for checking." Tina hesitated. "Frank comes in here every other Tuesday. Never says much. But Axel, well, that dog only growled once, and it was at a man who had a switchblade in his coat." Rachel looked up sharply. "Did anything happen?" Tina shook her head. Not that time. Axel scared the guy off before he even reached the register. Nobody called the cops. But since then, most folks know better than to mess with him. She nodded toward the door where the two men had exited. Except the loud ones who think old means weak. As Tina walked away, Rachel turned her eyes back toward Frank. His coffee still sat untouched, and his hands had retreated into the sleeves of his jacket, resting in his lap. She considered approaching again but hesitated. Her father had taught her not just battlefield medicine, but the quiet art of leaving someone's space when they needed it. Still, something about the look in Frank's face stuck with her. Not shame, but the sting of humiliation, the kind that clung to men who used to be lions. She thought of her father then. Dr. Joel Carter had been a tall man, wiry and composed, always with a stethoscope hanging from his neck like a medal, even in their kitchen. He had served 3 tours, had seen limbs torn, lives lost, and had saved more than anyone could count. When Rachel was 12, she had asked him why he never flinched during fireworks. He had smiled bitter and small. Because the ones who can't sleep through them, they're the ones who had to listen to real ones falling. Rachel's memory of him now, the last real conversation they'd had before he deployed, was of him buttoning up his uniform and telling her, "Strength is quiet, Ray. Courage is loud only when needed. And always protect the ones who can't protect themselves, even if they don't ask." She exhaled, her breath fogging the diner window. The snow had started to fall, thin flakes gathering around the curb outside. Suddenly, movement caught her eye. Frank had stood. Slowly, with effort, he reached into his coat, pulled out a few crumpled bills, and left them neatly by his cup. Axel rose immediately, his frame fluid and alert as if no time had passed at all. Rachel rose too, instinct more than intention. She met them halfway near the door. Frank looked up at her, face creased not just by age but by the fatigue of carrying something heavy and unseen. "Thank you," he said simply. "You're welcome," she replied, unsure what else to say. There was a beat of silence. Then he added, "You remind me of someone. She stood up for me once. In a different town. Different war." Rachel felt something pull at her throat, but she only nodded. Axel looked up at her, his amber eyes curious, like he recognized a rhythm in her heartbeat. "You were a medic?" she asked quietly. "Infantry. But I learned to stitch in the mud," Frank said. "Axel here, he was trained in Kandahar. Bomb detection. Lost his handler in an IED strike. They were going to put him down." Rachel felt the breath catch in her lungs. "I fought like hell to get him reassigned. Took months, forms, letters. But they finally let him come home with me. He's lucky," she whispered. Frank gave a soft laugh, rough, low. "No, I am." He opened the door. The wind burst in, tossing snowflakes onto Rachel's boots. Frank paused at the threshold. "You take care, document." "You too," she said, watching as he and Axel disappeared into the cold. Back at her booth, Rachel stared at the half-eaten sandwich, then pushed it aside. Her stomach no longer knew what it wanted. She stood, pulled on her coat, and stepped outside. The wind hit her full in the face. She glanced down the street, but Frank and Axel had already vanished into the snowy haze. As she turned to head home, she passed a man sitting on a bench at the bus stop, hunched under an oil-stained parka had drawn low. He looked up briefly, revealing weathered skin, a scruffy beard, and hollow eyes. He didn't ask for change. He didn't speak. But Rachel noticed a plastic military tag hanging from his coat zipper, worn smooth. She reached into her coat pocket and handed him the untouched sandwich. He blinked, surprised, then nodded silently. She nodded back. Some wounds weren't visible. She walked home in the dark, the snow melting into the creases of her gloves. And though her feet ached and the day weighed on her shoulders like an invisible gurney, she walked taller than before. Snow had thickened in Boulder since the first flakes danced against the windows of Maggie's diner. Now it fell in steady silence, layering the streets in clean white as if trying to erase whatever had passed earlier that night. Street lamps glowed amber against the dark sky, and the sidewalks had emptied, save for drifting flakes and tireless wind. Rachel Carter pulled her coat tighter as she stepped out of the diner, boots crunching softly beneath her. The door swung shut behind her with a soft jingle, swallowed by the cold. Frank Dawson was already outside, standing under the flickering light of the awning, his breath visible in the night. Axel stood beside him, ears upright, body still, his gaze scanning the empty lot. Rachel hesitated, then caught up to them, her gloved hands shoved into her pockets. "Can I walk you part of the way?" she asked. Frank looked over at her. The lines on his face seemed deeper in the cold light. He gave a small nod. "I'd appreciate that." The three of them walked in quiet formation, Frank at the lead, Axel between them, Rachel slightly behind. The alley behind the diner curved like a narrow spine between two rows of old brick buildings. Dumpsters lined one side, and the other was a solid stretch of wall painted with fading murals. Snow muffled their steps. The silence was almost peaceful. Almost. Rachel wasn't sure what made her feel at first. Maybe it was Axel, who slowed suddenly, his tail stiffening. Maybe it was the air, how it shifted, held its breath. Or maybe it was instinct, the old, sharp echo of her father's words. Always watch corners. She didn't have time to shout before they stepped into the crook of the alley, and it happened. The first man lunged from the shadow of a dumpster, red beanie, though the hat was gone now. His face was twisted, furious, and desperate. In one hand was a switchblade, glittering under the alley light. "Told you you'd regret it," he hissed. Rachel moved on reflex. She shoved Frank back with both arms, hard enough to send him stumbling against the wall. Axel barked, a single deep sound, then launched forward, but not before the blade found her. Once, burning pain just below her ribcage. Twice, in her shoulder. A third into her side, then again and again. It felt like lightning behind her ribs. She didn't scream. Couldn't. Her knees buckled, and she hit the frozen concrete hard, breath exploding from her lungs. Axel snarled, a sound that ripped through the alley like a thunderclap. He collided with Red Beanie mid-step, jaws clamping onto the man's arm with bone-snapping force. The man howled, dropped the knife, staggered, and swung wildly at the dog. His companion, shorter, broader, face covered in a ski mask now, emerged from behind a trash bin and kicked Axel viciously in the ribs. Axel yelped, but didn't let go. He shifted, lunged again. The man with the mask hesitated, saw Frank frozen nearby, and turned to run. Red Beanie followed, one hand bleeding, the other clutching his ribs. A voice rang out from behind the diner. "Hey, what the hell?" A delivery worker, tall, wiry, with a pizza bag slung over one shoulder, ran toward the scene. His name tag read Damon. He looked barely 21, with thick glasses fogging in the cold, and a trembling phone in his hand as he shouted into it. "There's a woman. She's bleeding bad. Send help." Rachel blinked, struggling to see. Her world had narrowed to pain and spinning light. She felt something warm beside her, Axel, his muzzle pressed to her shoulder, whimpering, licking gently at the blood pooling under her. "Go," she rasped. "Frank, get him, go," her voice cracked. She reached up weakly, trying to press against the wound at her side, but her hand slipped. Frank dropped beside her then, one knee in the snow, eyes wide in horror. "Stay with me," he whispered, pressing his hands over the worst wound. "Help's coming. Don't move, document." Rachel could barely hear him. The pain came in waves now, numb in between. Axel stayed close, growling low at the end of the alley in case the attackers returned, his fur wet from snow and blood, but his body trembling with focus. Damon crouched nearby, still on the phone. Yes, she's conscious, but she's losing blood fast. Yeah, multiple stab wounds. And a dog, yes, the dog's trained. Please hurry." Sirens sounded in the distance, warbling faintly like echoes from another world. Rachel closed her eyes, not because she wanted to, but because they were too heavy to keep open. Her final thought before everything went black wasn't about pain. It was her father's voice, drifting up from somewhere far away, the sound of his laugh in the kitchen, the way he called her Ray. Then nothing. Snow had blanketed the streets of Boulder by the time the ambulance screeched to a halt in front of Boulder Valley Medical Center. Red and blue lights reflected off the fresh drifts like a warning strobe, turning the white powder into a battlefield canvas. Inside the ambulance, Rachel Carter lay motionless, strapped to the gurney, pale lips slightly parted beneath the oxygen mask, blood-soaked scrubs clinging to her like a second skin. The gurney jolted as it was wheeled down the ramp, flanked by two paramedics shouting vitals. "BP 70 over 40 and dropping," one yelled. 5 stab wounds, left flank, shoulder, abdomen, bleeding uncontrolled. At the emergency bay doors stood Dr. Nina Lewis, a trauma surgeon in her early 40s with sharp cheekbones, ash-blonde hair pulled tightly back, and the kind of tired eyes that had seen too many midnight calls but never grew indifferent. Nina was known for her no-nonsense tone and surgical precision, traits honed from years working in fast-response units and sharpened after losing her younger brother in combat overseas. When she heard the incoming alert and the patient's name, her composure cracked, but only for a second. Rachel was more than a colleague. She was a student Nina had mentored, argued with, laughed beside in the break room. "Get her to Trauma 1 now," Nina ordered. "Page respiratory and line access. I want 2 units of Oneg hanging by the time I walk in." Following close behind was Jordan Ellis, a registered nurse with a background in critical care. He was in his late 20s, lean with dark curly hair and warm brown skin, wearing cartoon print scrubs and an expression now stripped of all humor. Normally quick with a joke, Jordan had always considered Rachel one of the strongest in the hospital, a sharp mind paired with a soft voice. Seeing her limp, blood-covered body made something cold coil around his chest. "For in her left arm's blown," he said, racing beside the gurney. "We'll go subclavian. I'm prepping the site." The trauma bay door swung open. Bright lights assaulted the room like stage beams. Gowns, gloves, masks, hands moved with orchestrated panic. Nina made the first incision, exposing the bleeding underlayer. "Pack the left quadrant. We've got active arterial bleeding near the renal border," she called out. Beads of sweat formed beneath her mask as suction whined and metal clanged into trays. Outside the operating room, Frank Dawson sat motionless in the hallway, hands pressed tightly between his knees, his coat still dusted with snow. Axel, now caked with dried blood and slush, lay curled at his feet. The dog's ears twitched at every passing stretcher, every monitor beep. Every once in a while, Axel would lift his head and emit a low, guarded growl whenever a loud voice or the smell of fresh antiseptic passed by. But otherwise he stayed silent. Watching, Frank looked down at his trembling hands, still stained with Rachel's blood. In war, he'd seen comrades fall, but this was different. This was someone who had chosen to protect him with no command, no oath, no obligation. Just human decency. And now she was behind glass, dying under a flood of lights. An hour passed. Then another. It was close to midnight when the first figure appeared. A man in his 50s, tall and squared-shouldered despite the limp in his left leg, wearing a black bomber jacket with an embroidered Navy SEAL patch. His name was Marcus Trent, and he had once served with Frank in Panama in the early 90s. Word had spread through the underground veteran network like wildfire. Frank hadn't asked anyone to come, but they came anyway. He walked up to Frank, gave a nod, nothing more, and sat beside him. Axel sniffed the man's boots and then relaxed. Frank didn't speak. Marcus didn't need him to. Minutes later, 2 more men arrived, one younger, with a freshly trimmed haircut and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and another older, stockier, with weathered hands and a silent look of understanding. Neither wore uniforms, but their bearing spoke volumes. One by one they arrived. Former Marines. Retired airborne medics. A K-9 handler from Fort Carson. They did not speak loudly. They didn't salute. They just sat, or stood along the corridor walls, back straight, eyes forward. Inside the trauma room, Nina's hands were cramping. "We're losing the distal flow," she warned. Jordan adjusted the suction and handed her clamps, his fingers slick with blood. "Another bleeder at the splenic artery. Tie it off." "Carefully, Rachel, you stubborn girl, stay with me," Nina muttered. Back in the waiting hallway, Angela Park, a petite Korean-American resident with oversized glasses and a big heart, arrived still wearing her puffy snow coat. She had studied with Rachel since their first year and had always admired her ability to remain calm when others panicked. Angela's cheeks were wet with tears as she approached Frank and gently touched his shoulder. "She's strong," she whispered. Frank said nothing, but his jaw clenched. More men arrived. By 1:30 a.m., over 20 veterans lined the hospital corridor, some seated cross-legged on the floor, others leaning against vending machines. A security guard tried to enforce visiting rules once, but Marcus simply shook his head. "We'll be quiet," he said, and the guard backed off. Inside, Rachel's vitals finally stabilized. Nina, voice hoarse from shouting, leaned back and removed her gloves. "Let's close. We've done what we can," she said. Her scrub top was stained, her eyes glassy. Jordan nodded, still holding Rachel's hand. "She's still with us," he said softly. She was wheeled to ICU minutes later, hooked to machines that beeped like whispers in the dark. Angela and Jordan flanked the bed, wiping her face gently, brushing back blood-matted hair. "We got you," Jordan whispered. "You're not alone." Outside the ICU glass, Frank pressed a hand to the window. Axel sat upright beside him, ears pinned forward, tail unmoving. More veterans stood behind them now, shoulder to shoulder, a silent watch. No orders, no commander, just presence, just gratitude, just love repaid in the only language they all understood, showing up. Dawn crept slowly over the snow-covered rooftops of Boulder, Colorado, bleeding pale gold across the frozen city like a promise half-whispered. The hospital's rooftop HVAC units steamed rhythmically, and beneath the humming lights of Boulder Valley Medical Center, a silent formation had taken shape. By the main entrance, on the sloping walkway, around the benches near the ER bay, and even under the overhang by the ambulance dock, they stood. More than 150 men and women, dressed in weather-worn military coats, unit patches, faded camouflage caps, worn jeans, and thick boots. Some carried duffels slung over one shoulder. Others came empty-handed, gloved fingers curled into fists tucked deep into pockets. They spoke in nods, in silence, in the occasional shared thermos of black coffee passed between calloused hands. And they stood with discipline, not from orders but from knowing. Former Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Recon, Special Forces medics, retired handlers. Many had never met Rachel Carter. A few had never even been to Boulder. But every single one of them had heard. The word had moved like a pulse through secure chats, old group texts, and quiet calls between former teammates. A woman, young off-duty, unarmed, had stepped between danger and a retired military working dog. She had taken the blade. For him. For the man. And by proxy, for every one of them. So they came. Inside the ICU, Jordan Ellis leaned on the railing of Rachel's bed, watching the soft beep of the monitor trace out the rhythm of her heart. Her skin was still pale, her lips chapped and dry. Tubes ran from her arms. A ventilator clicked in quiet intervals. He had been there all night, alternating between whispering to her and helping rotate ice packs to control her fever. His eyes were puffy from lack of sleep, his cartoon scrubs wrinkled and spotted with saline. Jordan had always been the nurse who made people laugh, the one who knew everyone's birthday and made balloon animals for pediatric patients. But today his face was hollowed by grief, fatigue, and something deeper, fear that someone good, someone too rare, might not come back. Standing beside him now was Dr. Anwar Saeed, the hospital's chief of trauma, a tall Pakistani-American man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair, and the posture of someone who had long ago accepted the weight of other people's lives. He spoke in a low baritone, carefully paced. "Her vitals are stabilizing," he said, eyes on the monitor. "Pulse is strong. Blood pressure is inching up. That's something." Jordan didn't look up. "She's fighting." "She is," Anwar agreed. "Keep talking to her. She might hear more than we know." Anwar had seen miracles before, survivors pulled back from the edge by things no scalpel or medicine could explain. But he had also buried too many young professionals who gave too much of themselves and burned out in the end. He glanced down at Rachel's hand, wrapped in gauze but twitching slightly. "She's not done," he murmured. The glass outside her ICU room gave a clear view of the courtyard, where the veterans had begun to spread across the grounds in solemn stillness. Their presence was starting to draw attention. Nurses changing shifts slowed at the window. Techs from radiology stood by the elevator longer than usual, peering over the lobby railings. Whispers spread across floors. At 6:15 a.m., Angela Park entered the ICU again, carrying 2 coffees and a box of blueberry muffins she'd picked up from a 24-hour bakery downtown. Angela, still in her oversized gray coat with fur trim, was small-boned and wore her nervous energy like a second uniform. She barely made eye contact as she passed a cup to Jordan, then pulled a chair up to Rachel's side. "I told the charge nurse I'm not leaving this unit today," she said quietly. "She smiled at me yesterday," Jordan whispered, voice cracking. "Right before her shift ended. I said something dumb about frozen yogurt. She rolled her eyes and said, 'You're like a dad joke in nursing shoes.'" He choked out a breath that trembled on its way out. "Now she's in there, and she doesn't even know they're all here for her." Angela turned to the window and blinked. Her glasses fogged slightly from the heat of the room. "They haven't moved. Not once." Down below, a new figure joined the formation. Staff Sergeant Elena Marquez, a K-9 handler with cropped black hair and a presence that seemed to carry the wind with her, stepped into the circle. She was 35, Latina, compact and wiry, with a jawline like it had been carved in determination. She wore a desert tan jacket and had a photo of her late K-9 partner Velox laminated and clipped to her collar. She stood silently, one hand resting on her chest, the other gently stroking the ears of the shepherd beside her. Ranger, a 4-year-old working K-9, alert and still. Ranger sat beside her like a sentinel, eyes fixed toward the ICU windows as if he knew someone behind that glass needed him. Back upstairs, Frank Dawson hadn't left the hallway outside Rachel's ICU door. He sat on a hard plastic bench, Axel at his feet, wrapped in a fleece blanket that Angela had brought down 2 hours earlier. The old man's face had hardened overnight, not into anger, but into something more grounded. The kind of grief that had structure, the kind that only old soldiers knew how to carry. A social worker named Claire Montgomery approached hesitantly. Claire was in her early 40s, with warm hazel eyes and a gentle smile that masked the exhaustion of someone who had spent 10 years navigating grief, financial ruin, and broken systems on behalf of families. She crouched beside Frank, her navy cardigan brushing the floor. "Mr. Dawson," she said softly, "we'll have an update soon. Would you like some water?" Frank didn't answer. He simply reached down and scratched behind Axel's ear. "She did what no one else would," he murmured. "She didn't know me, but she stood in front." Claire looked out the window and swallowed. "And now they're all here standing for her." That was when Rachel's finger twitched again. Jordan caught it first. His breath hitched. She moved. "Rachel, hey, it's Jordan. You're here. We're with you." He reached for her hand gently, gripping it through the gauze. Angela stood quickly, coffee forgotten. "Rachel? It's me, Angela. You're okay. You're safe. You're not alone." The monitor beeped slightly faster. Anwar returned, adjusting her oxygen slightly, eyes focused. "If she's waking up," he said, "this could be the turn." Angela leaned closer. "You've got people waiting, Ratch," she whispered. "You've got a whole damn army outside." And beneath the morning light, they still waited. Silent, motionless, proud. The air in the ICU was still, thick with antiseptic and the hum of machines that had become the background music of waiting. Sunlight, pale and gold, filtered through the blinds, dusting everything with a quiet glow. In room 414, Rachel Carter lay between 2 states, one of pain, one of possibility. The monitors around her beeped in steady rhythm, a song that, for the past 36 hours, had been sung by machines alone. But now something changed. Her fingers twitched again, stronger this time. Her lashes fluttered. Jordan Ellis sat on the edge of his chair, clutching her chart, but not looking at it. His eyes were locked on her face. Angela Park stood at the foot of the bed, her hands wrapped around a cold coffee cup, lips slightly parted in quiet disbelief. Then, like a whisper, Rachel's eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, brown flecked with gold, the same eyes that had once scanned X-rays with practiced calm, now glazed with confusion and pain. Her brows drew together slightly as her vision adjusted. A croaky breath left her mouth, rasping against the cannula that delivered precious air. "Rachel?" Jordan's voice cracked. He reached out, careful, his fingers hovering just above her hand. "You're back. You're okay. You made it." Rachel blinked slowly. The light was too bright. Her body felt like it had been stitched together from pain and exhaustion. Her throat burned. Her lips cracked when she tried to form a word. Angela stepped closer and gently brushed a strand of hair from Rachel's temple. "Hey, it's me. You're safe. Don't try to talk yet. Just be here." Rachel's eyes wandered, sluggish and searching. The ceiling tiles, the four lines, the green-tinted monitor. Then they drifted sideways toward the wide window. And stopped. Beyond the glass, through slats in the blinds and faint streaks of melting frost, she saw them. Rows upon rows of men and women stood outside, motionless. Some in faded fatigues, others in battered leather jackets. A few wore full dress uniforms. Their postures were strong, disciplined. They didn't move. They didn't speak. Some held caps over their hearts. Others clasped hands behind their backs. They were lined across the courtyard, filling the space like a silent wall of devotion. Rachel's eyes filled. Her throat clenched. She remembered only fragments, Frank's voice, Axel barking, the knife flashing in the cold. But she didn't remember these people. And yet somehow they were hers. The room buzzed to life around her. Jordan was already pressing the call button, voice shaking. "She's awake. Dr. Carter's awake." Angela burst into tears, letting the coffee fall to the floor with a dull thud. She grabbed Rachel's hand. "They've been here for you. Since the first night. They never left." Outside the ICU door, Frank Dawson sat in his usual seat, his back hunched forward, hands clasped between his knees. Axel had dozed, tail twitching in light sleep. But the moment the nurses moved faster, the moment the alarm stopped warning and started singing with purpose, Axel sat up. His ears perked. His nose twitched. Then slowly the tail began to wag. Frank stood slowly, his knees stiff from hours of waiting. His face, leathered by age and weather, pulled tight with something that hadn't quite dared to become hope. A nurse named Tasha, tall and broad-shouldered with cornrows tucked into a navy blue bandana and an instinctive warmth about her, stepped out and met his eyes. She was a night shifter who'd been pulled into extra hours because she didn't want to miss it. "She's awake," Tasha said softly. Frank's mouth fell open slightly. His hand reached for the wall to steady himself. Axel barked once, a single, sharp, joyous sound. He moved toward the door, slowly, hesitantly. Inside, Rachel turned her head weakly at the sound, and when she saw him, truly saw him, her tears spilled freely. Frank entered and stepped to her bedside. He looked smaller now, or maybe the room felt bigger with so much emotion pressed into its corners. His lips trembled as he took her hand. "You didn't have to do what you did," he whispered, voice rasped with age and gratitude. "But you did. You stood in front of the danger. You didn't even know me." He blinked hard. "And now they're all here. Because of you." Axel patted forward, ears lowered in gentle recognition. He placed his chin on the edge of the bed, eyes watching Rachel closely. When she weakly moved her fingers toward him, he licked her knuckles with the tenderness of a soldier greeting his commander. Dr. Anwar entered with two nurses and gently adjusted Rachel's oxygen level. "Try not to speak, Dr. Carter. Let your body catch up with your soul." Rachel couldn't speak anyway. Her voice had been stolen by the pain, the tube, the sheer overwhelming tide of the moment. Angela stepped beside her again. "They said they weren't leaving until you woke up." "Who?" Rachel mouthed. Angela smiled through her tears. "SEALs, Rangers, K9 handlers, medics, soldiers, people from units we don't even recognize. They heard what you did." Rachel turned back to the window. The crowd still stood. Dr. Saeed leaned toward her, voice low. "You did more than survive, Rachel. You reminded people what sacrifice looks like. You made them remember who they are." Outside, the sun rose higher, bathing the formation in golden light. Someone in the crowd raised a hand in salute. Another followed. Then another. A ripple of motion moved through them. Not loud, not dramatic, but reverent. Frank squeezed Rachel's hand. "They're not just here for you," he said. "They're here because in you, they saw all of us. The ones who served. The ones we lost. The ones we hope the world doesn't forget." Rachel closed her eyes. Not from pain. From the weight of gratitude. It was heavier than the blade. But it was warm. Recovery wasn't a dramatic crescendo of triumph. It was quiet, brutal, repetitive. It was Rachel Carter lying awake at 3 a.m. trying to breathe through pain like fire licking up her side every time she moved even a millimeter. It was physical therapy sessions that left her soaked in sweat after 10 minutes. It was wincing when nurses changed her dressings. It was the relentless ache in her ribs, the weakness in her legs, and the haunting image of a knife flashing in the dark that refused to leave her sleep alone. But it was also laughter, unexpected, raw, when Jordan walked in wearing sunglasses and declared himself her unofficial bodyguard, armed with a plastic sword from the pediatric wing. It was Angela sitting cross-legged at the foot of her bed reading gossip headlines aloud, deliberately mispronouncing celebrity names until Rachel smiled. It was Axel, the German shepherd who had once lunged into danger for her, resting his head on the mattress during visiting hours and letting her stroke his ears with trembling fingers. The pain never left entirely, but it wasn't alone anymore. Her room became something between an ICU suite and a quiet outpost of some forgotten military outpost. Former SEALs and Army Rangers rotated through her days like clockwork, leaving behind stories, snacks, and a quiet, immovable presence. They came in flannel shirts and service patches, sometimes with dogs, sometimes with photographs. They rarely stayed long, never overstayed their welcome. But none of them left without saying, "You're one of us now." One morning, a woman appeared by her door. Captain Miranda Wolf, mid-40s, dark-skinned with a military ponytail pulled back so tight it gave her cheekbones razor-sharp edges. She wore civilian clothes, black slacks, a green utility jacket, polished boots, but there was no mistaking her posture. She moved like someone who'd seen battlefields with no map and had survived every one. Her voice was calm and deep, like quiet thunder. "Dr. Carter, I'm the director of the Veterans Civic Alliance. We're a coalition of service members, medics, and K-9 partners across the state. We've been following your story closely." Rachel was sitting up that morning, bruised but lucid. Her foreline trailed across her wrist like a pale thread, and a pillow was tucked beneath her right side to ease pressure on the sutures. "I want to offer you something," Miranda continued. "No press. No cameras. Just this." She handed over a sealed envelope. "A gift. From people who believe that protecting others without hesitation is worth remembering." Rachel opened the envelope with unsteady fingers. Inside, a check for $100,000 made out in her name. A post-it was attached. "Use it for healing, yours or someone else's." "You earned it." She didn't cry. Not immediately. But something inside her chest, long wound tight, cracked open. Over the next few weeks, the money didn't sit untouched. Rachel directed portions of it to hospital bills, quietly paying off outstanding balances not only for herself, but for 2 elderly patients she had remembered from months before, veterans who'd missed appointments because they couldn't afford transport. She funded a shuttle card anonymously in their names. She had always been practical, but now she was purposeful. It was Miranda who returned again 2 weeks later, this time with a proposition. "We want you to come work with us," she said, sliding a small folder onto Rachel's lap. "Community health advisor. It's a part-time position. You'd coordinate mental health resources for veterans in the region, organize clinics, help connect those who don't trust hospitals to people who listen first and diagnose second." Rachel looked down at the papers. "But I'm a doctor, a hospital doctor. And that's why we want you," Miranda said. "Because you understand that wounds aren't always physical. And you're one of us now. You bled for one of our own. Let us walk with you in whatever comes next." When Rachel was finally discharged, she walked out of Boulder Valley Medical Center with a cane in one hand and Axel walking beside her, Frank just a few steps behind. The sky was pale blue, the last snow of winter clinging to curbs. It felt quieter than she expected. Not triumphant, just grounded, as though the world had accepted her scars and agreed not to press on them too soon. A few weeks later, she stood in the back room of a community center with faded walls and a faint smell of linoleum and old coffee. The place was filled with vets, some seated in folding chairs, others leaning on canes or cradling tired service dogs at their feet. Rachel stood behind a folding table with a stack of flyers for an upcoming PTSD awareness seminar, her hand trembling slightly. But when she looked up and saw Miranda in the crowd, and Sergeant Elena Marquez giving her a thumbs up from the hallway, and a teenage volunteer setting out water bottles for guests, she didn't feel small. She belonged. That afternoon, she gave a short speech, voice low but sure. I used to believe medicine was something sterile. You treat the wound. You monitor vitals. You move on. But there's a kind of healing that doesn't show up on scans. The kind that happens when someone shows up for you, again and again, even when you don't ask. That's what this room is. It's proof that showing up matters. She looked down at Axel, lying calmly at her feet, his vest freshly cleaned, his tag shining. She reached to scratch behind his ears. I showed up once, she said, and you all didn't let me fall alone. That's what I'll spend the rest of my life paying forward. The auditorium of the Boulder State Civic Center was larger than anything Rachel Carter had ever stood in. Its vaulted ceiling held the hum of anticipation, soft and reverent, as rows upon rows of veterans, service members, medical personnel, students, and families filled the seats. The lights above cast a warm, even glow across the stage, where a simple wooden podium stood flanked by two banners, one of the Veterans Civic Alliance, the other of the K-9 Unit Honor Foundation. Rachel waited just beyond the curtain, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of her printed speech, though she had long since memorized it. Her knee still ached from the last physical therapy session, but she stood tall in a navy blue blazer, dark slacks, and a pin bearing the caduceus and a small golden paw. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, some strands escaping as they always did, softening the sharpness of her determined features. Her scars, some visible just under the collar, some hidden, had long ceased to embarrass her. They were part of her now. Miranda Wolfe, dressed in a dark dress suit and low heels, stood beside her. You don't have to do this, she said gently, her voice more mentor than commander today. I do, Rachel said, her tone steady. But not for me. Miranda nodded once, then stepped out to introduce her. A brief applause greeted the mention of Rachel's name. No one clapped louder than the man in the first row, Frank Dawson, clean-shaven for once, his olive coat freshly pressed, his posture stiff but proud. At his feet sat Axel, alert but calm, eyes fixed on the stage as though guarding it. Rachel stepped forward. The hush was instant. She adjusted the mic, took a breath, and spoke, not with the booming cadence of a politician, but with the even, clear tone of someone who had learned the cost of silence. 6 months ago, I left my shift as a trauma doctor thinking I was done for the day, she began. I was tired, hungry, ready to blend into the night. Instead, I met a man and a dog who changed everything. A murmur of recognition rippled across the room. I stood up in a moment I didn't plan for. I didn't think. I didn't have to. Something in me moved, like muscle memory I didn't know I had. And I'd do it again, because loyalty isn't a reflex. It's a choice, one I made without question. She paused, looked toward Frank and Axel. What I didn't expect was what came after. I woke up in a hospital, unsure if I would ever walk again. I didn't recognize the weight of the world I'd stepped into. I didn't know how far loyalty would go in return. She gestured toward the back wall, where a photo slideshow began to play, the sea of veterans who had stood vigil outside her hospital window. Men and women in silent ranks, dogs by their sides, some saluting, some praying, some simply standing still. They came, she said softly, not because someone ordered them, not because they owed me, but because they knew what it meant to stand for one of their own, even if she hadn't worn the uniform. Among the audience sat Colonel Eugene Kravitz, a decorated Air Force veteran with a thick mustache and a soft spot for dogs, who had flown in from Texas just to attend. Beside him, Lila Winters, a widow of a K-9 handler, held a photo of her late husband and their retired dog, Max, now graying at her feet. Rachel continued, voice steady. Loyalty isn't on paper. It doesn't live in the ink of a contract or in the lines of a code. It lives in the moment someone stays after the crowd goes home. It lives in the nights people wait without sleep, not because they must, but because their heart won't let them leave. Her eyes scanned the crowd. Many had tears in their eyes. Some had their hands over their hearts. A few nodded silently. In that moment behind the diner, Rachel said, her voice softer now, I didn't think about being brave. I thought about Axel. I thought about the look in his eyes. Focused, protective, alive. I knew, without question, he would have done the same for me. Axel let out a soft, low woof from the first row. Laughter broke through the tension, warm and brief. Rachel smiled. She leaned forward slightly. That's the thing about these dogs. They don't hesitate. They don't ask if it's worth it. They move. And that's what we must do for each other. Behind her, a final image filled the screen. Rachel in her hospital bed, Axel's head resting on her lap, Frank sitting beside her, both of them looking toward the window full of silhouettes. Because of that moment, I found something I never knew I was missing. A family. She folded the speech and stepped back from the podium. Silence held the room for one long second, then erupted into a standing ovation. More than 500 people rose to their feet. Some cheered. Others clapped quietly, reverently. Frank wiped at his eyes with a worn handkerchief. Axel stood and let out another short bark, tail wagging, then sat tall, proud, dignified. But it wasn't just the humans who understood. Outside the auditorium's open side doors, under a line of trees, sat more than a dozen dogs. German shepherds, Belgian Malinois, golden retrievers, even an aging Labrador in a service vest covered in faded patches. Some were active K9s with their handlers. Others were retired, lying beside wheelchairs or next to elderly veterans. When the applause rose, they stirred. Heads lifted. Ears twitched. Some barked. Others simply watched. As if they knew. As if they understood she was one of theirs. Back inside, Miranda approached the podium again, but said nothing for a moment. She simply placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder and squeezed once. And in that moment, no one left. No one turned away. They stayed. Because sometimes the truest kind of honor isn't in ceremony or medals. It's in being there and refusing to leave. Sometimes the most powerful miracles don't come with lightning or loud voices from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a woman who chooses to stand between danger and a wounded soul, in the loyal eyes of an old dog who never gave up, or in the silent gathering of strangers who show up not because they must, but because love demands it. This story reminds us that God often moves through the kindness of ordinary people, through small acts of courage, and the invisible thread of loyalty that connects hearts, human and canine alike. Rachel didn't perform a miracle that night behind the diner. She became one, because she chose to act when it would have been easier to walk away. And maybe that's the real miracle, not divine intervention from above, but divine inspiration within. When we choose love over fear, compassion over comfort, we become part of something greater. In our daily lives, we all have chances to be like Rachel, or like Axel, to show up, to stay, to speak up for someone else. You don't have to wear a uniform to protect the vulnerable. Sometimes a word, a prayer, or simply listening can change someone's life. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and type Amen to honor those who never walk away from doing what's right. Pray for those who still carry wounds we cannot see. Share this video with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of love, courage, and healing. Tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed a quiet miracle? May God bless you and your family. May He guide your steps with courage. And may we all learn to recognize the quiet heroes around us every day. Amen if you believe.